Hello everyone, you're welcome back to Young Sweet Ladies Place once again. My name is Yinka. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be showing us how to make off-shoulder bustier gown. For this project, I used 2 yards of Ankara fabric. So let's get started. Here are the materials I'm going to be using for this project. Here's my paper gum, my lining, and my Ankara fabric. So the first thing I'm going to do, just like I did last week inside the princess that bustier that we did, first I'll cut out the amount I'm going to be using to cut the upper part of the gown, and I place my fabric on fold and I measure quarter of my bust measurement with extra 4 to 5 inches. Then the length is going to be twice my waist length measurement. Then after that, I'll cut it out. So after cutting it out, I'm going to be opening it like this. Then I'm going to iron my paper gum on the wrong side of it. Just like this, I'll place my paper gum on top of it. Then I'll use my iron to press it down. Then after that, I'm going to repeat the same thing on the lining. I'll cut exactly the same size of lining and I'm going to fuse my paper gum on top of it as well. So after gumming my paper stay on the fabric, you can see I'll place the fabric back into 2 folds. We are cutting the front part of it first. Then I'll layer my lining on top of it. Like I said earlier last week, I like cutting both the lining and the fabric together. So I'll place my lining into 2 folds as well, and I'll make sure I align everything properly. This is a folded edge and they both match equally. Then after that, I'll just press it so that everything can remain in place. So the next thing I'm going to do now is to measure 1.5 inch as my guideline so that I can have a starting point for my project. Then after that, I'll roll the 1.5 into a straight line just like this, and all my measurements, my vertical measurements are going to start from there. So because it's an off shoulder, I'm going to be placing my tape rule like this. I'm going to be minusing 5.5 inches from all my vertical measurements. If you don't want it to open too much, you can minus 4. If you want it to open like opening your cleavage, you can minus 6 or 6.5. So from there, I'm going to measure down all my vertical measurements. The length of my armhole is 9. Then my nipple point is 10.5. Then my underbust length is 14. I'll make a point. Then after that, I'll measure my waist length, which is 17, with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then after that, I'll just extend the lines. This is my armhole length, which is going to be my chest line. Then this is my nipple point. This is my underbust length. This is my waist length. And this is 1/2 inch seam allowance that I'm going to be using to join it to the lower part of the gown. So the next thing I'm going to be doing now is to measure half of my shoulder measurement on the guideline. My shoulder is 16 divided by 2 is 8, so I'll mark it on my guideline like this. Then I'll measure this same thing on my chest line. Then I'm going to roll it into a straight line. Then after that, I'll place the curved part of my ruler in between this line and I'm going to get my armhole curve. So at this stage, if you're not making a bustier, you can just put all your circumference measurement and that's it. But because we're making a bustier, I'll go straight to my nipple point. My nipple to nipple measurement is 8 inches. If I divide it by 2, it's going to give me 4. Then I'll add 1/2 inch for seam allowance, make it 4.5. So I'll measure the 4.5 on my nipple point like that. Then I'm going to go to the starting point of my pattern. I'm going to add 1 inch to my nipple point, making 5.5. I'll measure that 5.5 there like that, because I don't want the princess line to be straight, like getting to my neck. So that's why you need to make it a little slanted. Then from there, now from my nipple point, I'll roll it straight to the waistline. Then from the nipple point, I'm going to connect it to that 5.5 mark that I mark on the starting point like that. Then after that, I'll measure the distance between my nipple point and my underbust. The distance between my nipple point and underbust is 3.5 inches. So I'll divide the 3.5 inches into 2. 3.5 divided by 2 will give me 1.7. So I'll measure that 1.7 on this side, on the underbust, and also on the half length. Then at this other side, I'll measure 1/2 inch that. So this is how it looks. The reason for measuring that 1.7 at the other side is just to create a cup for our bustier. So from the nipple point, I'm going to come down by 1 inch. That's where the dart leg is going to stop. So from there now, I'm just going to connect the point. Then first on this bustier side, I'm going to rule this point straight to the waistline, starting from the underbust. Then I'll use the cuff part of my ruler to create my cuff. So from the underbust, just place the cuff part of your ruler and create your cuff like this. If you don't have this French cuff, you can still use your hand. Just roll it and then use your hand to make it round. So at this upper part, I'm going to input the same 1.7 that I measure at the underbust. I'm going to measure it here at this upper part. This is to help me create my cuff at this upper part as well. So I'll place the cuff part of the ruler again, touching the nipple point, and also touching the 1.7 that I have on the upper part, and then I'm going to just create my cuff. So this is how everything is looking now. So the next thing now is to input my measurements. So on my armhole line, which is also my chest line, I'll measure 1/4 of my bust measurement. Then on the waistline, I'm going to measure 1/4 of my waist measurement. This is my waist measurement divided by 4. Then after that, I'll just connect these 2 points together. So the next thing we are going to be doing now is to replace all our darts. At this chest line, you measure the distance of the darts that is here. Here I have 1/4 inch, so I'll mark the 1/4 inch. Then at the waistline, I have 2.2, so I'll measure the 2.2. Then after that, I'll connect it together like this. So this is our dart replacement. So after the dart replacement, the next thing is to add our seam allowance. So I'm going to be adding 2.5 inch seam allowance. So anytime I'm making a bustier and I'm putting lining inside it, I use 2.5 as my seam allowance. So I'll just put this 2.5 seam allowance on the chest line and also on the waistline, then I'll connect it. Then at this upper part, you are not going to replace these darts because normally you don't want your off shoulder to get into your shoulder. So you can see where the neckline stops. It did not get to the shoulder point. So it's inward, like 2 inches inward more than your shoulder measurement. So you're not going to be replacing this dart here. So the next thing you're going to do now is to extend this center panel. Because if you don't extend the center panel, it's not going to be matching with the side panel. So you need to extend the center panel by 1/2 inch. You need to extend it by 1/2 inch so that by the time you are joining the center panel and the side panel together, they can align properly. So just extend the center panel by 1/2 inch, just like I'm showing you now. So the next thing now is to cut it out. So this is our dart. We are going to be cutting it out. And then this part is also dart. You are going to be cutting it out. So all these shaded parts are going off from our pattern. So I'm going to be cutting it out now. First I'll cut on the waist length. Make sure the lining and the main fabric are lined properly before you start cutting. Ensure everything is properly aligned. You know, we stack the lining on top of the main fabric. So I'm done cutting. This is how everything looks. You can see the dart. We already cut out the dart, and then this is it. So the reason for adding that 1 inch, I'm going to show you now. You can see, just match the center panel with the side panel. You can see how it matches well. I didn't mean you did not add that extra ½ inch. It's not going to match. So the center panel is going to be shorter than the side panel if you don't add that ½ inch. All right, so if you open it up, this is how it is. I've not cut out the neckline. We are going to be cutting the neck after joining these panels together. That's when we are going to be cutting the neck. So moving on, we are going to be drafting the back now. I already placed my main fabric into 2 fold. You can see the Ankara fabric is placed into 2 fold. Also, the lining is folded into 2, and I've stacked them on top of each other, making sure they align properly at the front side and also at the upper part. So because it's an off shoulder, we are minusing the same thing that we'll minus in front. So I'm going to be minusing 5.5 because that's what we minus in front. So I'll place my tape rule 5.5 away. Then from there I'll measure down the length of my armhole, which is 9. Then my waist length is 16 at the back. I remove 1 from the 17 that I have in front. So at the back I measure 16, then with ½ inch seam allowance. Then after that, I'll extend all the lines. Then after that, I'll measure my zip allowance. My zip allowance is 1.5, so I'll mark 1.5 like this, and then I'm going to roll it into a straight line. So after that, at the waistline, I'm going to enter in by ½ inch so that I can reshape the zip allowance so that the zip will not bulge at the back. So I'll just connect it like this. So I'm going to measure that same ½ inch here again, and I'm going to blend it back like this. So this is my zip allowance, and the essence of doing this coming in of ½ inch is just to prevent the zip from bulging at the back after we are done with making our garments. So note, all our measurement is going to start from this line here. So at the upper part, I'm going to measure my shoulder measurement divided by 2 minus 1.5 inches. My shoulder is 16 divided by 2, that's 8. If I minus 1.5 from it, that will give me 6.5. So I'll measure the 6.5, and I'll also measure that same 6.5 on my armhole line. Then I'll connect it into a straight line. Then after that, I'm going to get my armhole curve like this. Then after that, on my chest line, I'm going to import quarter of my bust measurement. That is my bust divided by 4 plus 2 inches seam allowance. We are using 2 inches seam allowance at the back here because it's not into panels. We are not cutting out our dart into panels. So that's why we are adding just 2 inches. So the next thing on the waistline, I'll measure quarter of my waist measurement plus 1 inch dart, then plus 2 inches seam allowance. Then after that, I'll connect the points together. Next thing now is to shock our dart. So my nipple to nipple distance is 8. If I divide that by 2, will give me 4. So I'll measure that 4 inches starting from the line. Then I'll roll it up to my chest line. Then on my chest line, I'm going to come down by 1 inch. That's where my dart leg is going to stop. So I'll take half inch dart on both sides of the line. Then I'll connect it back to the chest, to the 1 inch below the chest line like that. So that's it. We are not going to be cutting the dart out. So the next thing we are going to be doing now is to cut out the pattern. So after cutting it out, you are going to be notching the zip allowance both up and down. Then you also notch the center of your dart because we are not cutting out the dart like I said. Just notch it, notch the center, and also you make a small cut on the dart legs, just a little snip on the dart leg like that, so that you can know where your dart is starting from. Then you transfer the dart to all other layers. So if you open it up, this is how it looks. So moving on, the next thing we're going to be doing now is to cut out the sleeve. First, I'll place my fabric into 2 folds. Then I'll fold it into 4. We are cutting the 2 sleeves together. You can see my fabric is folded into 4. So the first thing I'm going to do is to rule a guideline so that I'll have starting point for this sleeve. So after that, I'll measure the cap height. I'm using 4 inches for the cap height against the normal 5 inch I usually use because this is off shoulder, so I'll just measure 4 inches. Then after that, I'll measure my armhole length on this cap height line. My armhole is 9 plus my seam allowance. For the seam allowance, I use 1.5. So at the M part, I'm going to measure my round sleeve measurement with my seam allowance. Then you can see the length of the sleeve is 10 inches with 1.5 seam allowance. So this is my starting point, this is my cap height line, this is my length, and then that is my allowance. So on my starting point, I'm going to be measuring 4.5 inches. So anytime I'm making all shoulder, I usually measure 4.5 inches. But if the person is really big, like from shoulder 18 inches upward, or if the person is so chubby or broad-chested, I can use 5 inches, but I've never used more than 5 inches. So after that, I'll connect it to the cap height line. So the next thing I'm going to do now is to connect from the measurement on the cap height line. I'm going to use my ruler and connect it to my round sleeve measurement on the M part of the sleeve. Then after that, I'll cut it out. So when I get to my seam allowance, I'll fold the seam allowance upward, then I'll complete my cutting. So the next I'm going to do now is to cut out my lining for the sleeve. So I'll just fold my lining into 4, just the way I folded the name fabric, and then I'll place the fabric on top of it and I'll trace it out. So the lining is going to stop exactly at the actual measurement of the sleeve. You're not going to be adding any allowance to the lining. So fold your seam allowance upward and then cut it straight. So this is my lining, and then that's my main fabric. So the next thing is to cut out the down part of my gown. I've explained this process in the previous video, so I'm going to leave the link in the description box. So I'm not going to be going through the process of explaining how to cut the pencil skirt part of the gown. So this is it. So I'm done cutting out the skirt part. So next I'm going to do is to cut the skirt on the lining, because that is the only part that I did not do inside that video, because there was no lining in that particular one. But this one we are going to be putting lining. So I've cut out the skirt part of the gown. So I'll fold my lining into 2, then I'll trace out the front first, then I'll also trace out the back. Note, when you are cutting lining, your lining will stop at your actual measurements without the seam allowance at the length. So this is it. I'm going to be cutting out the lining, and I'm going to be folding my allowance upward, just the way you folded the allowance on the sleeve. You fold the allowance away also on the skirt part, so that your lining will not have the allowance of the length. So this is it. You can see the lining stop at actual measurement. Okay, look at it. There's no allowance on the lining. So I'll also cut the back the same way I did for the front. I'll fold the length allowance away, then I'll trace out the shape on the lining. So we're going to be sewing our gown now, and we're starting with the front part of the upper bodice. So this is the center panel, then this is the side panel, this is the second side panel. So the next thing you want to do is to place it on top of each other, right side to right side, and then you're going to stitch it down. So when you're done with one side, repeat the same thing to the other side. So this is it. The next thing you want to do now is to notch the seam line. Just make a small cut on the seam line, but don't cut through the sewing. So if you turn it to the right side now, this is how it looks. So the next thing is to repeat the same thing on the lining. So join all the panel of the front lining together, and then you notch as well. So moving on, we are going to be sewing the back. For the back, the first thing is to sew in your dart. So follow your shocked mark on the fabric and then sew in your dart. Or if you did not shock it the way I did not shock mine, just hold it on the dart that you already notched, and then you sew it in, and then you stop where you have your dart mark. So the next thing is to sew the sleeve. So we are going to be using lining to turn the sleeve first. So I'll place my lining on top of the sleeve. You can see first I'll sew the line. You can see that the lining is shorter than the main fabric because we did not add allowance to the lining. So first I'm going to match the lining together at the upper part, and I'm going to stitch with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then when you are done with the upper part, you bring the lining and you match it with the hem of the sleeve again, and then you are going to stitch the hem of the sleeve. So this is it. So the next thing is to close the side of the sleeve. So you are going to match the lining together at the armhole curve, just the way I'm showing you now. Match them together. Let the lining and the main fabric align at the armhole part like that, and then you are going to stitch the sides together. When you are done with one side, you repeat the same thing to the other side. Ensure they align properly at the armhole side before you close it. This way the lining is going to pull up the allowance of the main fabric upward, so that the lining is not going to be showing under the sleeve by the time you are done sewing your clothes. Okay, so from the armhole you are going to bring it to the right side, because that's those two places as the only opening left. You can see. So just bring it to the right side. So if you turn it now, this is how it look. You can see that the lining pull up the allowance upward. So you keep it aside and you repeat the same thing to the other side. Alright, so moving on, we're working with the skirt part now. This is the front part of the skirt. We're going to be keeping it aside because there's no dart in our front skirt. So we'll be keeping it aside, and then we're going to be working with the back part of the skirt. So this is the back of the skirt, and we have 2 pieces for the main fabric and also 2 pieces for the lining. The reason why it's 2 is because the back is going to have zip, so we have zip allowance. That's why it's into 2 pieces. So the first thing I'm going to do is to sew in the dart. So I'm going to sew my dart on all the pieces. You know, we have 2 for the main fabric and 2 for the lining. So the next thing I'm going to be doing now is to iron the upper part of the gown, that is the bustier part. I'm going to open the dart with my iron, and I'm going to create the cup for it. You can see this is how it looks now. I've ironed the bustier part, and I've put the stay inside it. I've explained this process in the previous video, the last week video. So after ironing, the next thing is to cut the neckline. So I'm going to align the lining and the main fabric together. I will match everything together very well, making sure everything aligned properly. So after that, I'll fold it into 2. I'll fold it into 2. So after folding it into 2 now, you can see the upper part now, we only have 6 inches left. From the upper part, we only have 6 inches left. So we are going to be shaping the waist seam first, so that before we do the neckline. So align everything properly, and then at the waistline, this is the waistline here, at the waistline, you will measure 1 inch upward at the side seam. Just measure 1 inch upward at the side seam, and then you blend it towards the front. This is to allow the front and the back bodies to match properly. Then after that, you trim it off. If you remember, at the back we use 16 inches. Meanwhile, the front length is 17. So this is to allow the size seam of both the front and the back to match properly. So moving on to the neck now, we are going to be shaping it. So I'm going to be making a sweetheart shape for the neckline. So this is the upper part, as you can see. So from this upper part, I'm going to be measuring 2.5 inches downward. You can still go down more than that. Then after that, I'll connect it just the way I'm showing you now, so that I can have a sweetheart shape for the neckline. But if you don't want a sweetheart neck, you can still do a round neck. Just measure the length you want for the neck and then you blend it. Whether round or V, anyone you want. But I'm going for a sweetheart neck. Let's assume that you are making a V. After measuring that 2.5 inches downward, just use 3 parts of the ruler to connect it. Then if if you're making a round neck, just use the round part of the ruler to connect it. But I've used my hand to form the sweetheart shape, so I'm going to cut it out. So if you open it up, this is how the neckline looks. I have a beautiful sweetheart shape here. So we are going to be cutting the neck for the back as well. First, I'm going to iron the darts flat. Then after that, I'll match them together, both the lining and the main fabric. I'll align everything properly. If you like, you can shape the neck before cutting the back out, because there's no panels at the back, so you can cut it before sewing the darts in. But I just like doing it like that. So after aligning it together, I'm going to fold the zip allowance inward like this. I'll just fold the zip allowance away. Then I'm going to measure the length of the neck. For the depth of the neck, I did 3 inches. So I'm going to blend it like this towards the side, and I'm having a V neckline, not really a V, like a kind of round V shape. So this is the back. So if you open it, this is how it looks. So the next thing we are going to be doing now is to join the upper part with the lower part. So we are going to be joining the skirt parts to the upper part like this. You take to the sewing machine and then you join it together. This is the back. You do the same thing to the front. You know we have 2 sides for the back, so don't forget you're joining the 2 sides to the upper part. So this is the front part of the skirt. You're going to be joining it to the upper part. This is how it is. So you're going to be joining it together like this, and then you're going to repeat the same thing to the lining. So moving on, we are going to be sewing it together now. This is the skirt part of the front. I'm going to take the front part of the upper bodice and I'm going to match them together, right side facing right side, and I'm going to stitch the waist together with 1/2 inch seam allowance. When you're done, you're going to do the same thing to the lining. Then moving on, this is the back. You match the upper part to the lower part on the waistline, and we are going to stitch together with 1/2 inch seam allowance. So this is one side. You do the same thing to the other side, and then you're going to repeat it on the lining. All right, so this is the front again. I've joined it together, as you can see, and then this is the lining for the front. I've joined the upper part to the lower part. So the next thing I'm going to do is to match the right side of the lining to the right side of the main fabric, and I'm going to stitch them together at the hem line. This is the hem of my gown, I'm going to stitch it together with 1/2 inch seam allowance. When you're done with the hem part, you are going to put the lining up to match with the neckline of the front. Align them properly, let them match at the neckline. This is the neckline. You are going to stitch together again at the neckline with 1/2 inch seam allowance, following the shape you have there. We have a sweater shape. When you get to the midpoint of the neckline, you are going to put the needle here, and then you are going to rotate the fabric, and then you sew the other side. So when you are done sewing the neckline, the next thing is you are going to notch. It's very important. Starting from the mid part like this, just notch it, cut it very close to the seam, but don't cut the seam. Then you notch every other part as well. But the center is very, very important so that the shape can come out nicely. Then after that, you are going to be stitching the sides together. This is the side. Align the lining and the main fabric together properly at the armhole, and then you stitch the side. You are going to repeat the same thing to the second side as well. Match them properly at the armhole side, and then you stitch the sides together again. So after that, you're going to be bringing the clothes to the right side from the armhole side. You can see the only opening left is just the 2 armhole. So from there, you bring it to the right side. So by the time you bring it to the right side, this is how it looks. You can see this is how it looks. So I'll keep it aside and move on to the back. This is the back. I'm going to be using lining to turn it as well. So you match the right side of the lining to the right side of the main fabric at the back, and then you are going to stitch it together. Starting from the lower part, match the hem of the lining with the hem of the main fabric, and then you stitch together with 1/2 inch seam allowance. When you're done with the lower parts, you match them together at the neckline, and then you stitch. After that, you stitch the side. And don't forget, you're going to be notching the neckline as well. Make sure you notch the neckline. Then the only opening left is just 1 armhole. So you bring it out to the right side from there. Then when you're done with this side, you repeat the same thing to the other side. You know we have 2 sides of the back. So this is it. This is how it looks. After that, you're going to iron everything flat. This is the 2 sleeve. We've ironed it flat. This is the front, ironed smoothly. You can see. If you turn it to the wrong side, this is how it looks. You can see that the lining drag up the allowance upward. And then this is the cupped part. You can see. So you keep it aside. This is the back. I've ironed it flat as well. This is the 2 sides of the back. And then the next thing you want to do now is to place it on top of each other at the zip allowance side. This is the zip allowance side here. This is the zip allowance side. And if you remember, the zip allowance is 1 1/2, but now we already sew it with lining, so the zip allowance is remaining just 1 inch. So the next thing is to attach your zip, but before you attach the zip, you measure the length of the zip. Wherever you want the zip to stop, you mark it, or you can just measure 9 inches downward from the waistline, because that's what I usually do. Measure 9 inches downward from the waistline, and then from that point you are going to sew it down to your slit opening. Usually if I'm making a short gown, my slit opening is 6 inches, so I'll measure 6 inches and I'm going to roll it straight from that 9 inches downward from the waistline up to that point. So from here now I'm going to make a stitch. So from that 9 inches below my waistline, I'm going to make my stitch all the way to my slit opening. So when I get to my slit opening, I'm going to keep my needle in and I'm going to sew it this way. Then after that, I'll open it to the right side and then top stitch. So the next thing is to fix my zip. I believe we know how to fix zip by now because I've been showing us how to do that in the previous tutorials. Alright, so after fixing my zip, this is how the back looks. You can see this is the back. So the next thing I'm going to be doing now is to shock my measurement, starting from the armhole side. From the center of my zip, I'm going to measure my bust divided by 4 minus ½ inch. Then on my waistline, I'll measure my waist measurement divided by 4, but I'm not going to be minusing half. Then on my hip line, I'm going to measure my hip measurement divided by 4. Then I'm going to connect these points together like this. Then from the hip line, I'll just roll it straight down to the hem. Then at the other side, I'm going to repeat the same thing, starting from the center of the zip. From the armhole side, I'll measure my bust divided by 4 minus ½ inch. Then on the waistline, I'll measure my waist measurements divided by 4. Exactly my waist divided by 4. Then at the hip line, I'm going to measure my hip measurements divided by 4. And note all the measurements start from the center of the zip towards the side. Then I'll connect the points together. I'll use the curved part of the ruler to connect from waist to the hip. Then from the hip, I'll roll it straight down to the hem. Alright, so the next thing we're going to be doing now is to attach the sleeve. So I'm going to place the sleeve. This is the back, you can see. I'll match the sleeve right side to right side. I'm going to stitch the armholes together. And I'm going to stitch with ½ inch seam allowance. So I'm done attaching the sleeve to the back part of the gown. You can see this is how it looks. So the next thing is to take the front and then you match it together with the other sleeve. You can see this is this other side of the sleeve. I'll match them together at the armhole, right side to right side, and I'll stitch together. When you're done with one side of the front, then you attach the second sleeve to the other side of the front as well. Don't forget you're joining it together with ½ inch seam allowance. So now we're done attaching the sleeve to the dress. So the next thing you want to do now is to close the sides. You can see this is how it looks now. The sleeve is joined together with the bodice. So the next thing we are going to be doing now is to close the side. So you turn it to the back side of the dress. You know we already shocked the measurements. Then you are going to stitch together following your shocked line. and you're done with one side, you repeat it to the other side. For the other side, I'm going to be starting from the lower part, but I'll first match the same on the waistline together so that it can align properly. Then I'll start stitching from the lower part so that it can be easy for me to stitch. I will just be following the line that I already shocked. And that's it. Our gown is ready. So the next thing is just to turn it to the right side and then you iron, and that's all. You can see this is how it looks from the right side. And here is the outcome of our project. The gown fits nicely and I love it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in my next tutorial. Bye.